Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one involves schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is one of the big bads of psychology. For much of psychology's history, it was a disorder that we were pretty much unable to treat. There really wasn't anything that doctors and psychologists could do, particularly for severe cases. Sometimes people would get better on their own, sometimes they would find that they could function, but in a lot of cases, up until the rise of medical treatment of using medicine in order to treat, there really wasn't much that could be done. But people have wanted to know for a long time what causes it, particularly since this disorder, well, getting ahead of myself. People used to think that this disorder came from the fact that people had a bad childhood, that they had a bad family environment, that they had cold mothers and absent fathers, or absent mothers and cold fathers, or I mean there were all sorts of variations, or that someone would undergo a huge amount of psychological trauma and it would then cause schizophrenia. No, it doesn't look like it. Now, this is not saying that a bad family environment or psychological trauma can't necessarily trigger schizophrenia, but it does not appear to create it out of nothing. Which brings me back to what here is called the stress vulnerability hypothesis, but which I also call the Diathesis-Stress Model. And that is that perhaps there is some kind of biological vulnerability. There's a biological tendency towards schizophrenia that a person may inherit or may develop before birth or even maybe after birth. But that stress in the environment brings it out. You could see why then people might think, well, a disturbed family environment brings out schizophrenia because they had to, creates it. It doesn't create it, but it may indeed start the ball rolling. Now, exactly where is the problem? Where is this vulnerability? What is the vulnerability? And it appears to be different for the different types of schizophrenia. Now, the old-style division of schizophrenia into paranoid and catatonic and hebephrenic and such is not necessarily useful here. What's more useful is the new-style division, and to my mind the better, certainly the simpler way to divide up patients with schizophrenia, and that is in terms of their symptoms. Positive symptoms means that a person has too much of something or it's wrong. So hallucinations, delusions, that sort of thing. Negative symptoms are when a person doesn't have enough of something. Lack of emotion, lack of speech, lack of movement, that sort of thing. Now, it looks like possible causes of schizophrenia can fall very nicely across that divide. For instance, it's possible to mimic positive symptoms of schizophrenia by increasing dopamine in the brain. A lot of stimulants do that. Stimulants like cocaine and methamphetamine, for instance. The reason we like stimulants is that they increase dopamine in our brain, and we find that pleasurable. But you can go too far. And if someone has taken a lot of a stimulant, that's why doctors sometimes talk about cocaine psychosis or methamphetamine psychosis, where a person is hallucinating and has delusions and can't sit still and whatnot because of this drug, because of the amount of dopamine in their brain. It's also interesting that a lot of the drug therapies that treat positive symptoms do so by reducing the amount of dopamine in the brain. And the symptoms go away. Now, the odds are it's not that simple. Nothing in psychology or biology tends to be that simple, that schizophrenia is merely too much dopamine. But it certainly does seem to be a factor, and it does seem to be something biological that could happen. Let's say that a person is hovering right at the top edge of the quote-unquote safe amount of dopamine in their brain, and something happens that causes them to produce more dopamine, and it pushes them sort of up into schizophrenia. It also explains why people with positive schizophrenia, positive symptoms of schizophrenia rather, tend to have a better outcome than people with negative symptoms. People with positive symptoms tend to get better at a higher rate than people with negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So what might negative symptoms be? Negative symptoms of schizophrenia look a lot like a brain injury. If someone has had a fairly significant brain injury or a collection of smaller brain injuries, like a lot of concussions, very often they wind up not showing much emotion, not talking much, not moving much, which looks a lot like negative symptoms. And this also makes sense if you think about treatment, because it's a lot easier to reduce the dopamine in the brain than it is to try to build in more neurons into the brain. And also people with negative symptoms of schizophrenia, oftentimes, when scans are done, when MRIs are done of their brains, they often seem to show the same kind of brain structure, or in some cases lack of brain structure, that people with repeated head injuries show. The ventricles through the brain that the cerebrospinal fluid travels through are often larger in people with schizophrenia, as in people who've had serious head injury. Or there may be fewer of the wrinkles in the cerebral cortex. And it's very interesting. But again, it's probably too simple to say this is exactly it. Now, where does this lack or this too much come from? At least in some cases, it would appear that it comes from heredity. This is a slide looking at relatedness and risk for schizophrenia for individuals. For instance, identical twins, if one twin has schizophrenia, roughly 48% of the time, so does the other. So it's called a concordance rate. Offspring of two patients with schizophrenia. So both parents have schizophrenia. 46% of the time, so does the child. Fraternal twins. Identical twins share all of their genes. Fraternal twins share half. It drops to 17%. But they do have the same environment. Because if you compare fraternal twins with siblings, they share the exact same percentage of genes, but they do not share the exact same environment. And it drops from 17% for fraternal twins to 9% for siblings. And also then, an unrelated person, it's about 1%. So you can see the odds are, there's genetics going on here, but it's not just genetics, because otherwise the identical twin concordance rate would be a lot higher. But there's obviously something genetic going on, but there's obviously other things going on as well. Maybe it is with the identical twins that both have the vulnerability, but only one gets the trigger that sets it off. It's hard to tell, but there's definitely something genetic going on here. But then again, if something isn't genetic, then exactly how might it come about? Well, there's a couple of interesting things that might be going on in terms of people with schizophrenia. One is the Toxoplasmosis Effect. Now, toxoplasmosis is it's a disorder that's caused by a parasite. And this parasite is found fairly commonly in cats. Cats carry the parasite with no problems. And we were fairly sure that human beings carry the parasite with no problems either, unless a woman is pregnant. It's why if you look on kitty litter boxes and bags, they have on there in big letters, pregnant women should not clean litter boxes, because the parasite is shed in the fecal material of the cats. And it's possible that if a woman becomes infected with toxoplasmosis when she is pregnant, that there could be problems with her developing embryo/fetus. But researchers have also found a correlation between developing schizophrenia and toxoplasmosis infection. Now, before you go get rid of your cats, don't do it, okay? I'm a cat owner myself. And the increase here is so small, that added risk is so tiny, that the only reason it was found was because researchers looked at thousands, if not tens of thousands of people with schizophrenia, okay? It's a tiny, tiny, tiny effect, but it's there. And it may be that infection with that parasite at some point, perhaps in childhood, for instance, might cause a change in the brain. But you don't have to have a cat to be exposed. Because where do cats like to go to the bathroom? In dirt and sand. And a lot of kids play in dirt and sand. It's why a lot of playgrounds don't have sandboxes anymore. And why the places that do have sandboxes very often have lids for them to try to keep cats out of them. But it's fairly easy to be exposed to this, and for the vast majority of people it doesn't make any difference. Like I said, please don't go get rid of your cats. Just make sure if a woman is pregnant that she doesn't handle cat fecal material, and the odds are everything will be just fine. Another example that you can do even less about is the seasonality effect. Researchers, the same area certainly that found the toxoplasmosis, they were looking at thousands of individuals. These were in the Scandinavian countries in Europe that have had basically public health care, socialized health care as we like to call it in the U.S., not perhaps correctly, but They've had that for decades, and so they literally can track the health care of people from conception until death. And so they were looking at people with schizophrenia, and they noticed something interesting, that people born at certain times of year are more likely to develop schizophrenia than people born at other times of the year. And the time of the year, by the way, is between February and May. People born between February and May had a slightly, ever so slightly higher chance of developing schizophrenia than people born at the other times of the year. And the researchers were like, well, that's interesting. What are possible explanations? And so they looked at things like Christmas. Maybe all the partying in December causes a problem. But in the southern hemisphere, where Christmas is still held on December 25th, it's not February through May. It's more like August through November. It apparently has more to do with late winter, early spring kind of deal, being born late winter, early spring. And so they started looking at other things. Maybe it's exposure to light, because the further away from the equator, the stronger the effect they found. It's still pretty weak, but it's stronger. And they looked at all sorts of things, but then they noticed something that was quite strong. The seasonality effect is at its strongest in people born the spring following a big influenza epidemic. Influenza tends to hit about November. It tends to start petering off around February or March. And if you count forward 3 months or so, you get February through May in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, of course, it begins to really start getting going somewhere around May, and it peters off around, I don't know, September. And again, count forward. So there may be something about being exposed, something about the flu, that when a woman is pregnant somewhere during her second or third trimester and she gets the flu, maybe there's a deal there. And they were thinking, well, maybe it's the flu virus itself. But then they looked even harder and noticed that it appears to not be linked with the flu per se. It appears to be linked with running a fever. And that makes sense. The homeostatic temperature that human beings function best at is 37 degrees centigrade, 98.6 Fahrenheit. You crank it either above or below that, and we don't run so well. The same is true for the bacteria and viruses that infect us. They also function best at our body temperature, and it's part of the reason, if not the whole reason, why your body runs a fever when you're sick. Because your temperature goes up, it weakens those bacteria and viruses and gives your immune system a somewhat better chance to kill them off. But during gestation, everything should be as perfect as possible. And if you, pardon the expression, if you've got a bun in the oven and you turn the thermostat up for a while, that's going to cause some changes in that bun's cooking. That's a bad analogy, but you get the idea. Perhaps at some point during, like I said, second trimester, maybe beginning of third, the body temperature cranks up a few degrees. This could cause changes in brain development that could make a person predisposed towards schizophrenia. Now again, this doesn't mean that if you were born from February to May that you're doomed. Not even if you have a cat. Okay? It simply means that there is a slightly higher chance. And maybe your mom didn't get sick at all. You know, you never know. But it is interesting to look at all the possible things that could lead someone to become predisposed to schizophrenia. But again, I just want to remind you, as a cat lover and as someone who wasn't born during that seasonality window, but still, when we're talking about an increased risk, we're talking about maybe instead of a 1% risk, it's a 1.5% risk. It's not that big of a deal. It's only something that was found because researchers looked intensively at thousands and thousands of subjects. But it is really kind of interesting when we're wondering what might be the underlying cause of schizophrenia.